Okay, so I sent this, which I had shown you last week. Right, so what we have here, just to remind us, in Shemot, in Exodus, we have the description, the commandment of how to initiate Aaron and his sons into the priesthood. And it goes into some detail here. And then later on in Sefer Vayikra in Leviticus, we have the chapter that tells us when it actually happened that they were initiated into their service. And I highlighted here some of the differences, some of the things that are similar but slightly different. And the particular point of interest here has to do with the belt, the avnet. I also want to mention, Shira was kind enough to send me a very good, like a succinct summary of some of the things that Rav Hirsch has to say about the belt and some related things. And then I even followed up and I asked her to give me citations from where they are. I didn't, and I'm going to send those to everybody. I after thinking about it, I thought I want everybody to see first what we're going to talk about from the Gemara, which will help to give greater context to what Rav Hirsch says. So, and for Daniel, Rav Hirsch, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was a German rabbi, late 19th century. Very, very important rabbi in the modern period, particularly in Germany. And he wrote an extensive commentary on the Torah. And Shira, did he write on the entire Tanakh?
No, the Chumash. And so we have a lot of many scriptures, and also in this series Yeshurun, that's a journal, very famous journal, and he published always in this Yeshurun, but we have some scriptures and you can collect it, but only Chumash, unfortunately. So we have about the Tehillim, we have one volume about all the Tehillim from 1 to 150, and about Pirkei Avot. Yeah, but not about Nevi'im and whatever, the Nach.
So whatever we know about that are things that he said in other works, but he didn't actually write commentary directly on the prophets.
Yeah.
Right.
So about topics and themes, so he published in Yeshurun. Yeah, that's right.
So, and also, I just want to clarify his commentaries were written in German. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
So you get the original.
Original speak, yeah, because his German is very perfect and very high because he's a philosopher also, and you must know. So we have the opponents are first the Reform Judaism on the left or right side, as you want, and on the other side Christianity. So he is in the middle of, and he's engaged with Kant, Hegel, and German idealism, and very familiar with all this German traditions of philosophy. So, and also in opposition to this main avenue, Christianity and Reform Judaism coming up during the Haskalah and all these things. Yeah. And Mordechai Breyer and all this modern Orthodox in New York Yeshiva University coming from Hirsch. That's a very, very
direct line.
So Slovakia.
It's very direct line.
This avenue, it's coming from.
There was an essay. Sorry, 1 second. There was an essay by the historian Yaakov Katz that I read a long time ago It was about what he saw as the three rabbinic reactions to Reform Judaism. And one was the Chatam Sofer, and that became the seed for what we now call Haredi Judaism or ultra-Orthodox Judaism. One of them was Rabbi Yisrael Salant, who was the founder of the Musar movement, right? The moralistic teachings. And then the third one was Rav Hirsch. And of course, Rav Hirsch is essentially the beginning of what we now think of as modern Orthodoxy. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression, but thank you. So let's get into the meat of this. Last week I looked at some of these verses. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to jump into one of the sugyot in the Gemara right away. Just a second. Not this one. This one. Okay, let me make sure you see this. Okay. So, as we discussed, the clothing that the priests wore is described to begin with in Exodus, but not completely. And one of the details that's missing is we don't know how the belt of a common priest was made. It's not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the Torah, but we do know that that was one of the four garments that every priest wore. What we see in the verses that I put up side by side is some discussion about how Aaron, right? So Aaron is the first high priest, and then his sons are the first, we'll call them common priests. In Hebrew, we say Kohen Hetyot. How they were dressed. And the other thing I want to mention about this is, actually, maybe I'll just put that up on the screen again for a second, just to give a little bit more context. So this verse here, so this is in Exodus chapter 29, verse 1. It says, V'zeh hadavar asher ta'aseh lahem l'kadesh otam l'chahen li. This is the thing that you will do to them to sanctify them to serve me, and it's to be kohanim, to be priests for me. And then it says that they have to take certain sacrifices, both animal sacrifices and meal sacrifices, and it talks about how to do that. And then in verse 5, it says, and then l'kachta tabgadim, and you will take the clothing, and you will, in other words, this was a directive to Moses. You'll take the clothing, and you will clothe Aaron, and then it says, the order in which he's going to put on the clothes. And a little bit further down, it says, and his sons you also bring forward, and you're going to clothe them. And it also talks about how he clothes them. So what we see from the very beginning of this chapter is this process of Aaron and his sons being clothed and bringing particular sacrifices. It was this initiation, it was this process that invested them to become priests. Before they did this, they were not priests. They were people of the tribe of Levi, but they were not priests. And we know that there's more to this process. There was more to this because of what we know in the beginning of the book of Numbers and the book of Bamidbar. There was a special process whereby to begin with, all of the tribe of Levi had to take the place of all of the firstborn in order to be fit to serve in the temple, to be fit to serve in the tabernacle and later on in the temple. And this process is particularly for the priests who come from the tribe of Levi. So what we understand is that there is this process. This process, the Gemara elsewhere is going to call this chinuch, right? This is the chinuch, which is another way of saying dedication. This is going to be relevant to our discussion. So, now, as was noted in some of our previous classes, and I think maybe even Shira was the first one to note this a long time ago, this question of what about the belts, the belt of the high priest versus the belt of the common priest. So just to review, the common priest had 4 pieces of clothing. He had pants, he had a shirt, he had a belt, and he had a hat. And the high priest had those 4 plus 4 more. We're not going to talk about the 4 extra, but one of the things that the high priest also had was the belt. So there is a controversy amongst Tanaim, who were rabbis of the Mishnah, about if the belt that the common Kohen, the common priest wore, was that the same as the belt that the high priest wore in his clothing that he served in on Yom Kippur. Also, just one more detail for Daniel. So the high priest on a normal day would wear these 8 pieces of clothing, but on Yom Kippur, whenever he did service that was particular to the day of Yom Kippur, he had to change into special clothing that was all linen, and it was only 4 garments. It was only the 4 garments that a regular priest would wear. And the question is the belt that he wore, which is explicitly described as being only made out of linen, was that the same belt that a common priest wore all year round? Meaning that the common priest also wore an all linen piece of an all linen belt, or was it that the belt that the common priest wore all year around was the same as the belt that the high priest would normally wear, which was a mixture of several different sources. It was made from wool and linen in a particular pattern. So that controversy here in the Gemara, it's actually mentioned later on in the second sheets that I gave you. And I thought about starting from there, but on balance, I decided I'm going to start from here. It all comes back to the same thing. We'll see as it goes. So here we are in the Babylonian Talmud in Yoma on page 5, side B. And here, this part of the sugya that I'm presenting to you, it's coming really in the middle of other things that the Gemara is discussing. But this is kind of this whole thing that we're gonna do. It's kind of a parenthetical thing, and it starts off with a fascinating question. It says, it's talking about the priests, and it's talking about the priests being dressed for their initiation into the priesthood, and the Gemara asks, "Ketzad hilbisham?" How did he dress them? In other words, how did Moses dress Aaron and his sons? So Rashi here explains, what does it mean, how does he dress them? What was the order that he dressed the clothes of the father and his sons one after the other. So the Gemara asks a question on its question. It says, Ketzad Hilbishan, how did he dress them? How did Moses dress them? Mai dahava hava, that which was. In other words, however Moses dressed them is how he dressed them. And it's gone, like it's past. That only happened one time. It happened a long time ago. What does it matter? Like, it's not, there's the Gemara is asking, because the Gemara is mainly concerned with practical halachic conclusion, right? Which they want to know how the law is supposed to go. So what difference does it make to us how Aaron and his sons were dressed? Welcome, Paul. You came at a very important point, because this is a question that I think you very much interest you. So the Gemara says, "Ela ketzad malbishan la'atid lavo." So the Gemara says, okay, rather what we're asking is, how will Moses dress them in the future? In other words, sometime in the future, when God will raise the dead and make them alive again. So when Moses will be alive again and Aaron will be alive again. And then there's this idea that Moses once again is going to dress Aaron. So the Gemara says, okay, lavid lavo nami. So you want to know what's going to happen in the future? Okay, l'chashiyavo Aaron uvanav u'Moshe imahem. We'll know when Aaron and his sons and Moses comes with them. That's when we'll know. So before we go on, this whole question here is quite fascinating, because it's something that we've talked about several times in the class, which is when we study, like when we spend a long time studying the order of the way things were done in the temple, in this specifically in the second temple, but we studied about things in the temple, and we're concentrating on how the high priest did service in the second temple. And one of the things that we talked about along the way is that there are disagreements about what happened, about what actually happened. And we saw already a number of disagreements between different authorities about, let's say, the order of the way the service was done in the morning. Did we do the Torah before this or after that, and so forth. And so we talked about it, right? And it didn't seem to raise any immediate questions within the Mishnah itself. But now we see in the Gemara, this is a very interesting thing. The Gemara here asks this question when the question arises about how Aaron and his sons were dressed, specifically about how they were dressed. And the Gemara, to begin with, is bothered by the question, meaning, what difference does it make to us how they were dressed? Because that's something that already happened. So why would the Gemara be so, on the one hand, why does the Gemara ask the question? And on the other hand, why does the Gemara sort of push away the question? We would think that the Gemara is interested no less than it would be that we know that the Mishnah and the Gemara, they're interested to know the order of the way things were done in the temple. So does anybody have any thoughts about that before I go on? Like, why would by the way, I should just say one more thing. So this line of questioning, though, the Gemara shifts it. And the question the Gemara ultimately asks is this one. Ella, rather, Ketzad Hilbishan Lemisbar Kurai. Rather, what we're asking is, how did Moses dress them so that we can explain the verses? In other words, ultimately, the Gemara is concerned to understand what the Torah means when it describes the dressing of the Kohanim. But in order to get to that, to the explanation of the question, we do go through these questions and questions on questions, like what difference does it make to us how Moses dressed Aaron and his sons? So does anybody have any thoughts about why here does the Gemara get hung up on this question? What's different about this case than, let's say, when we talk about let's say, the order of the way things were done in the temple, where we know that it was very important to the Gemara to know that?
Maybe with Moshe, it was a one-time thing.
Therefore, what?
So it's not going to happen again. It's not important, as opposed to the temple service, which was repeated and God willing will happen again.
Yeah, so that's basically the simplest answer, that what we understand, and okay.
So Latit Lavo, does that mean at some time in the future, maybe the Beit HaMikdash should be reconstructed, or does it mean in the Olam Haba, Latit Lavo?
In this case, it's referring, but based on the context, it means the future, yes, when the temple is going to be rebuilt, and so there will be Tchiyat HaMetim, right? In the future, when Moses and Aaron are revived, because that's how the Gemara puts it, right? The Gemara says, "L'chishiyavo Aharon uvanav uMoshe imahem." When they come, in other words, when they are revived from the dead, and then they're going to reenact this, then then we'll know. We'll see how it happens. So I'm going to say build up on what Michael said. The Torah here is giving us explicit instructions for those particular people. The investiture of the Kohanim, beginning with Aharon and his sons, that was really a one-time thing. And then after that, their children and their children's children, children's children, they were all Kohanim. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, we understand from the Torah says, this is what you must do in order to sanctify them, to make them Kohanim. So this was, in fact, a one-time thing, although there is some allusion here to this idea that it will be reenacted Latid Lavo. I won't get into that because I want to look more into what people have to say about that. But basically what Michael said, I think, is correct. So this is why in all these other cases about the order of the way things were done in the temple, and we discussed this question, are they arguing about history? It's not just that they're arguing about history. They're arguing because on a practical level, we expect that the temple will be rebuilt. We don't know when it will be rebuilt. It might be rebuilt tomorrow, might be rebuilt in 1,000 years from now. We don't know, but we have to be ready for the temple to be rebuilt. And so those things we really need to know. But here, on the face of it, we don't really need to know. But ultimately, why does the Gemara say we need to know? Because we want to be able to explain the verses. So there's an act, at the very minimum, there's an act of Talmud Torah, right? There's an act of learning Torah that compels us to understand what happened. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to start with this sugya, because I wanted to discuss this very point, this question in the Gemara, which I think is quite fascinating. So now we understand, we understood from last time the differences between these two iterations of the dressing of the Kohanim. I'm just going to point them out again quickly. Yeah. Just to remind us, this, what I'm going to point out now, this is basically what the Gemara is asking here. How did Moses dress them? They want to understand these verses. That first it says, you're going to bring in, this is the verses in Exodus chapter 29, verse 4. You'll bring forth Aaron and his sons to the opening of the tent of meeting, and you will wash them in water, and you will take the clothing, and you will dress Aaron with the kutonet, with the shirt, with the I guess the shirt that the mi'il ha'ephod, the et ha'ephod, the mi'il ha'ephod is a kind of a coat that went under the ephod, and the ephod, which is a special garment, and the choshen, which is the breastplate, the afadatalo b'cheshev ha'ephod, and then you will tie him with the belt, let's say, of the ephod. The samta mitznefet al rosho, you'll put the hat on his head. V'natata nezer hakodesh al mitznefet. You'll put the crown, the holy crown, on top of the mitznefet, and that refers to the tzitz. It wasn't actually a crown, but something like a crown that went on his forehead. And then it says, I didn't highlight this. It says, and then you'll take the oil of anointment and you will sprinkle it on his head, and then you will anoint him. Okay, so very clearly, the first thing you do, you take Aaron, you dress him in his clothes, and then you anoint him. Then, in verse 8, you get banav takriv, then you bring forth his sons, vihobashtam kutanot. You also dress them in their shirts, v'chagartotam avnet, aharon uvanav, and you will gird them with their belt, with the avnet, Aaron and his sons. So we note, first of all, before we get to the other iteration, that in the dressing of Aaron, there are a couple of garments that are not mentioned. One are the pants. I think I mentioned last time. The Gemara learns elsewhere that the pants, they had to come out wearing the pants. That was the pants, of course, are always the first thing. But the other thing that's missing from this list in verse 5 and 6 is the avnet. It doesn't say that Moses had put the gartel, right, the belt, onto Aaron. And here it says, when he's dressing the sons, after he's put on the shirts of the sons, then he's going to put on the avnet, he's going to put on the belt, and it says, and he shall gird them with the belt, Aaron and his sons, lahem migbaot, and he'll put on their hats. The migbat was the hat that the sons were going to wear, because the hat that Aaron is going to wear is called a mitznefet, and they were slightly different, but basically hats for our purposes. And then they will have the priesthood as an eternal statute. In other words, with their dressing, with them becoming dressed in this fashion, this is what will make them kohanim. This is what makes them priests. You will literally fill the hand of Aaron and his sons. In other words, you will invest this authority to be priests with Aaron and his sons. So that's the way it's described in the way Moses was commanded to do it. But when he actually does it in Vayikra, in Leviticus chapter 8, so we'll start here with verse 7. Well, we can start with verse 6. So Moses brings forth Aaron and his sons, and he washes them in water. Back in Exodus, at this point, just so it's basically the same as verse 4. So he puts on him. So he's brought forth Aaron and his sons, but he's going to dress, he dresses Aaron first. And the first thing he does after he puts on the shirt, he puts on the avnet, he puts on the belt. And so forth. In the next verses, he puts on all of the rest of the garments that the high priest wore. And then a few verses later, in verse 13, it says, then separately he brings Aaron and his sons, and he puts on their shirts, and he puts on their belts, and then he puts on their hats as God commanded Moses. So there's a major difference, right? In Exodus, when the avnet is put on, Aaron got dressed, everything except the avnet. Then the sons get dressed, and the third garment that they put on is the avnet, and Aaron also puts on that is put on them. Moses dresses them. Aaron and his sons put on the avnet at the same time. And when Moses actually does this, he puts the avnet onto Aaron as part of the whole procedure of dressing him. And he puts on the avnet to the sons as the procedure of dressing them. So it's separate. So back to the Gemara wants to understand, this is what it means. And it says, Lemizber Karai. They want to be able to explain the verses because there is a difference between these verses. So let's look at Rashi here. Rashi says, "Mizbar karai delo nirme ahadades," to not literally, right? Not to throw them one on the other. It's not to ask a question from the one set of verses to the other set of verses. The bitzva aktiv in the commandment, which is the verses that we saw in Exodus, it reads, "V'chagarto tam avneit Aharon uvanav." You should put on them the avneit, Aaron and his sons. Mashma, implying chagiratam shel av ubanim b'seder echad. The girding of both the father and the sons was part of that, was the same order. It was done at the same time. V'lo hifsik lebishat beged acher benatayim. It was not interrupted by putting on another piece of clothing in the interim. In other words, that there would be let's say the belt would be put on Aaron, and then it would be interrupted by putting on other things on Aaron, and then go back to do the sons. And when it was actually done, Ktiv ba'aron, it's written about Aaron. In the order that Aaron was clothed, it says that Moses put the avnet onto him when he was dressing him. He dressed him with all of the clothing. And only after he finished putting on everything, including the avnet, did he bring the sons forward and dress them. In the telling of how it was actually done, he didn't put the avnet on Aaron and his sons at the same time. So that's the question. So the answer to this question is a machloket, right? It's a disagreement between, as we'll see, Pligi ba b'nei Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan. So there was a disagreement about this between Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan. Chadamar Aharon v'charkach banav. So one of them said the way it was done is the way it's described in Exodus, the way it's described in Shmot, that first Aaron was dressed, including the avnet, and then afterwards his sons were dressed with the avnet. And one of them says, Aaron uvanav bevatachat. Aaron and his sons had the avnet put on at the same time, the simple way of understanding it, the way it's described in Vayikra, in Leviticus. And just to remind us, when the Gemara here says that it's an argument between Rabbi so-and-so and Rabbi so-and-so, and then afterwards it says, one of them says and one of them says, it means that they had the tradition of the rabbis arguing, but they weren't sure which rabbi said which opinion. And that theme is going to come up again when we talk about this, about the avnet in particular. Okay, so, excuse me. Amar Abai b'kutonet umitznafet kule alma lo plige d'Aaron v'char kach banav. So now Abaye comes along, and he's a couple of generations after Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan. And he's going to explain, he wants to explain about their argument. And he says, okay, Kule Alma Lo Pligin. Nobody disagrees that Aaron and afterwards his sons, Ubein B'tzva'a Ubein Ba'asiyah Aharon Kadin. That whether in the commandment, as it's described in Exodus, or in the actual doing, as it's described in Leviticus, Aaron was first. Everybody agrees that Aaron was first. Tipligi ba'avnet. What they were disagreeing about was the avnet. In other words, as we saw it, that Aaron, of course, is going to be the first one dressed. That's clear both in Exodus and Leviticus. The argument between Bnei Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan was about the avnet. Manda Amar Haron v'char kach banav, the one who says that Aaron and afterwards his son, that's because it says vayachgor oto ba'avnet, v'harakti vayachgor otam ba'avnet. Because in the first, in one verse, right, which I have down here, this is the verse in Vayikra, which is the doing. It says that Moses girded Aaron, as we saw, but elsewhere it says Vayachgor otam avnei. When it's described in Exodus about how to do it, it says that he girded them with the avnet. So that Abai is explaining, this was the disagreement between Bnei Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan. He's not saying, he's not bringing support for one or the other. He's just saying this is when they disagreed about, was it Aaron and afterwards his sons, or was it Aaron and his sons at the same time? It wasn't about all how they were dressed entirely. It was only about how the belt was put on. Did they get the belt put on at the same time? Or did Aaron get his belt put on and then finish getting dressed? And then the sons got dressed and had their belts put on, or did they get them put on at the same time? Okay, so that's one opinion. So the one who says that Aaron and his sons were at the same time, because it says because it says that you gird them, right? And so that's what we saw back in Exodus. In other words, the command was to do them seemingly to do them at the same time, because they're all included in, you should gird them, and that would include Aaron and his sons. Okay, so now we have, okay, so those are the two sides of the question. But now we have this problem. How are we going to determine, right? Each of them has support in the verses for what they're saying. In Exodus, it says they were done at the same time. And in Leviticus, it says they were done one after the other. How can we reconcile these two verses? And that, again, that was how the Gemara framed this whole question. When it said Ketzad Hilbishan, how were they dressed? We want to know this in order to be able to explain these verses. So, according to the one who says that Aaron and his sons had the avnet put on at the same time. So hakti vayachgoroto bavnet, v'hadakti vayachgorotam avnet. So how does that person who thinks that that's what happened, that Aaron and his sons had the avnet put on at the same time, how do they explain what it says in Vayikra, in Leviticus, where it says explicitly that Aaron first put on his avnet, or Moses first dressed Aaron in his avnet, and then he dressed the sons in their avnet. So how does he reconcile? Amar lach Hahu avneto shel kohen gadol, lo zehu avneto shel kohen hedyot. So that person goes like the person who holds that the avnet of the kohen gadol, of the high priest, the belt of the high priest, that was not the same as the belt of the common priest. Okay, so now after all this, we start to see this is one of the places where this question comes in about the belt. Did the high priest and the common priest wear the same belt, or did they have distinctly different belts? Okay, so Hahu avneto shel kohen gadol. I'll skip over here to Rashi. Klomar le'olam kra ditzva'a dafke bevat achat. So it's true that when the command comes, they were supposed to be dressed at the same time. But later on in Leviticus, when it's described and they seem to separate the act of putting the avnet on Aaron from the act of putting the avnet on the sons, it's to tell us not that they were done really one completely after the other. They were done at the same time, but they're separated in Leviticus to explain that they weren't the same belt. Because if it had said in Vayikra that he put the belt on Aaron and put the belt on the sons, we would think that they all had the same belt, that those belts were interchangeable. But it's separated out to explain that the belt that Moses puts on Aaron, that was a special belt that only the high priest wore. And the sons wore a different belt. So so this goes in the line of the person who holds that they, in fact, they did put their belts on at the same time, not literally at the same time, but it means, as Rashi explained before, that Moses dressed Aaron, and at the point that he put on the belt on Aaron, he also put belts on, then right after that, he put the belts on to the sons. So this person says that's what happened for sure, but the belt that Aaron wore was distinct. It was a different belt than the belt that was worn by the sons. Now, I'll also just point out, so the belt that the high priest wore is described in the Torah, and that is this multicolored belt that's made from both linen and wool. So it means, it also implies then that the belt that the common priest wore, that the sons wore, was completely made out of linen. It would have been a white belt, completely made out of linen. According to the opinion that said that no, it's the way it's described in Leviticus, that first Aaron got dressed and completely dressed, and then the sons got dressed. So of course they have a problem because in the command it says v'chagarto tam avnei. In the command, it sounds like they're supposed to do them at the same time. Amar lach hahu kamashmalan avneton shel kohen gadol zehu avneto shel kohen hedyot. So he learns the opposite. He says that teaches us that the avnet that was put on to the high priest was exactly the same avnet that was put on to the common priest, meaning that the common priest wore this multicolored belt. Vayachgoro to avnet, vayachgoro tam lamali. So why does it say in one place that he, in the singular, that in Leviticus, that he puts it on Aaron, and then elsewhere it says that he put it on them? Shlamina Aharon v'chakach banav. That it tells us what this person's contention is, which was that Aaron was completely dressed, and then the sons got dressed. So then the Gemara ends off by saying, "V'vatachad mi mashkafet la." Second. So Sorry, there's a siren outside. I'm waiting for it to pass. So the Gemara asks the question, how could it be that they actually got dressed simultaneously? Moses was dressing them. How could he dress them simultaneously? Lo tzricha dakdi. No, we needed to explain the order that he would do Aaron first and then the sons after him. But as Rashi explained earlier, it means that Moses did all of the belts at the same time, like one after the other. Okay, so what do we get out of this? So we understand that from this discussion is relying on a Gemara that we'll see next, which is that we know that there's an earlier argument about this basic question of, was the avnet of the high priest on the regular clothing of the high priest, of the 8 garments, was that this multicolored belt? I'm sorry, that's clear. That's certainly a multicolored belt. The question was that the same belt that a common priest wore every day? And just to also remind us, one of the reasons that we're so interested in this question is because we know that actually there is a third set of clothing. And the third set of clothing is what?
For Yom Kippur.
It's the third set of clothing that's special for the high priest that he wears on Yom Kippur when he's doing the service for Yom Kippur. And that's also described explicitly later on in Vayikra, later on in Leviticus, as being entirely made out of linen. It's also very clear. So it's just this one detail, as it were, where the Torah is not explicit about the belt that a common priest wore. The Torah doesn't tell us what that belt was. It tells us the belt of the high priest for every day, which is the multicolored belt. It tells us the belt of the high priest for Yom Kippur, which is a linen belt, but it doesn't tell us what the common priest wore, which I think, and so of course that's what provokes this. That's what provokes the basic discussion, which we'll see in a moment, the machloket about which one it was. But then we also see that it spills over. It has other implications. It does have other implications. So for here, this whole thing that we just did now, that we just looked at now, as the Gemara itself says, it's a parshanut issue. It's a question of how do we understand the verses that are written in the Torah? What is the Torah telling us about the order in which the garments were put on the priest, the high priest, and his sons? But now because our time is limited, I won't go through all of Rashi here. I'm gonna skip over to the other sheet that I sent. So this is a little bit later on in the Gemara. And I broke this up into pieces to make it a little bit easier to go through. I do realize that sometimes it's difficult to follow these things, but I try to make it as clear as possible. Let's start to go through this, and I'm going to try to get through this whole sugya today. Omatkinin lo kohen acher. Okay, so here the Gemara is quoting a Mishnah that we saw. It's in the very first Mishnah in Yoma, that the high priest was set aside, right? He lived in a special place in the Beit HaMikdash for the 7 days leading up to Yom Kippur. And also, the rabbis would prepare another Kohen kind of like an understudy, because we're worried that maybe this Kohen Gadol, maybe this high priest, will become tameh, he'll become ritually impure, in which case he won't be able to do the service. So we need somebody ready to take his place. Now, remember, again, we started off this whole discussion by looking at the verses in Exodus, and we understood from those verses that in order to become a high priest, there was this process that Aaron had to go through. So now the question arises: how does somebody become? And we talked about this. Does that mean that what we? I'm getting ahead of myself. What we talked about is, okay, the investiture of priests to become priests, that was a one-time thing. That's what we concluded. That only happened once in history. It's not necessarily ever going to happen again. But we didn't discuss about becoming a high priest, because obviously not every priest is a high priest. So how does one become a high priest? There has to be some way of distinguishing him from other priests. So there's an indication from those verses that maybe in order to become a high priest, maybe you have to bring a sacrifice, maybe you have to wear the clothing of the high priest. It's not clear exactly, but what we're assuming is at the beginning of this whole Masechet, of this whole tractate, is that we said, like, we take the high priest and we set him aside for 7 days. We didn't say how he became the high priest. But now it's going to be a more immediate question, because what in fact happens if that high priest can't fulfill his duties and we need to bring in his understudy? So now, how do we know that he's the high priest? What makes him the high priest? Just because we said so? Well, maybe we have to know. So this is the Gemara. This is really the Gemara's question as it begins. Matkinin lo kohen acher. So that's the quote from the Mishnah. They prepare another Kohen in his place. Shita, this is the way I read the Gemara. Shita, it's obvious, and by the way, this is also a style that the Gemara uses in many places to lead up to a question. So it says, it's like saying, okay, granted, Shita, it's obvious, Ira bo psul kodem tamid shel shachar, mechanchin oto b'tamid shel shachar. Okay, obviously, if the high priest becomes invalid, right? He becomes tameh, or he becomes otherwise disqualified from fulfilling his duties as the high priest on Yom Kippur, but before he has brought the first sacrifice of the morning, then the one who's going to take his place, he will become initiated as the high priest by bringing the Tamid Shel Shachar, by bringing the sacrifice of the morning. How does bringing the sacrifice of the morning, how do we know that if he's bringing the sacrifice of the morning, that would make him the high priest? Why? How does that demonstrate that he's the high priest? We do the sacrifice of the morning every day. How do we know that now this guy who is stepping in for the high priest, now that he's doing this sacrifice, how do we know that makes him the high priest?
On Yom Kippur, only the high priest can do the tamid.
Exactly. So on this one day out of the entire year, the only person who's allowed to do the Tamid Shel Shachar, the sacrifice of the morning, has to be a high priest. So if people see that he's doing that sacrifice, that's his chinuch, that's his initiation into being the high priest, because that particular service can only be done by the high priest on that day. So that's how the Gemara begins. So this is obvious. If the if the first high priest, right, the originally designated high priest, becomes pasul, right, he becomes invalid from doing his service, and we have to bring in the understudy. So we understand if that first priest, the first high priest, becomes invalid before he brought the Tamid Shel Shachar, so the understudy, when he does the Tamid Shel Shachar, when he does the morning sacrifice, that's his chinuch, that's his initiation into becoming the high priest. Ela irabo psul achar Tamid Shel Shachar, b'meh mechanchin oto. So, but what happens if the first priest managed to get through bringing the Tamid Shel Shachar, and then he became pasul, then he became invalid to continue, and now we have to bring in the next priest. So now how will we know that he is now invested to be the high priest? So there are different possibilities which the Gemara is going to discuss. So the first one is Amar Avada Barava Ba'avnet. We'll know because of the belt that he's wearing. How does that indicate? How will we know by the belt that he's wearing that he's the high priest?
Because on Yom Kippur, only the high priest is privileged to wear, and he must wear, the pure linen belt. And so the avnet is the criteria to discern, because the 4 white garments, so the garments are the similar between Hedyot and the high priest. You can't discern between the Kohen Hedyot and the priest, the Kohen Hagadol, if you only see the garments, because without his 4 additional garments, he is similar to the Kohen Gadol and Hedyot. So it must be the avnet, but then it's clear that the avnet on Yom Kippur pure linen is not the ordinary belt during the year for the Hedyot. So Rabbi Ezel,
Ravada Barava.
yeah, so he has also implication for his purpose.
So very good. So Avada Barava says, so I also just want to point something else out. So we know this from learning the Mishnah earlier. After the Tamid Shel Shachar, after the morning sacrifice is brought, so the Kohen then changes into the special clothing for Yom Kippur, because the Tamid Shel Shachar, the morning sacrifice, because that's not particular to Yom Kippur, he did that sacrifice with the regular garments of the high priest, the 8 garments, and those are of course very different, right? There's gold and there's jewels and there's, it's quite a flamboyant kind of outfit. But now he's changed into the linen clothing of the high priest for Yom Kippur. So Gemara says, okay, so that's Ravada Barava's answer. We're going to go over a little bit again, but let's just go on a little in the Gemara. Hanicha lemanda amar avneto shel kohen gadol zehu avneto shel kohen hedyot. So Ravada Barava's answer that we'll know by the avnet, that's fine if you hold like the person who says that the avnet of the high priest was the same as the avnet of the common Kohen, right? As we just explained. So when a Rav Ada Barava says that we'll know by the avnet, as Shira explains, he's going according to this idea that the avnet that the high priest wore for his special Yom Kippur clothing, that was the only avnet in the Beit HaMikdash, the only avnet in the temple, that was pure white linen. Nobody else ever wore that belt. So when the understudy Kohen comes out and he's wearing all 4 white garments, including the avnet, now he's been initiated into becoming the high priest, and everybody sees that he's the high priest. Only the high priest wears that belt, and he only wears it on Yom Kippur, and he only wears it when he's doing the special service for Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, okay, that's a good answer, but it's only a good answer if you hold that the avnet of the Kohen Gadol that he wore normally was the same as the avnet that the regular Kohen wore normally, right? Because then there's no distinction in the avnet. Elamanda amar avneto shel Kohen Gadol lo zehu avneto shel Kohen Hadyot. But what about according to the opinion that says the avnet of the high priest was not like the avnet of the Kohen Hadyot? In other words, and here we're talking about the avnet that they wore every day, that the avnet of the high priest that he wore every day was distinct from the avnet of the common priest that he wore every day. How was it distinct? So as we said, the avnet of the Kohen Gadol every day was the multicolored avnet. The avnet of the common priest was a pure white linen belt, right? And so if that's true, right? So when the understudy Kohen comes out on Yom Kippur to continue the service, how are we going to know that he's the Kohen Gadol? Now he looks just like any other regular Kohen. So the Gemara says, what can we say? How can you answer that? In other words, what's the question? What does it mean, ma'ika l'meimar? What question do we need to answer now? Okay, let me recap, because we have to keep track of what's going on here. Our basic question was, if we have to bring in an understudy after the Tamid Shel Shachar, how do we initiate this understudy to become the Kohen Gadol? So Rav Ada bar Abba says he's going to be initiated because he's going to wear the pure white linen belt, and that's something that only the Kohen Gadol would do. So the Gemara said, okay, that's fine if you say that that's the only time that that belt would be worn, and that only the high priest can wear it. But what are you going to say according to the person who says that actually that white belt looks just like the white belt that every common Kohen wore every day? So what are we going to say? In other words, now how will we know that the understudy Kohen is now in fact the high priest? That's the ma'ika l'meimar. So Amar Abaye. So Abaye says, okay, this is what he'll do. Lovesh shmone umapech betzinora. So Abaye says, okay, even though now the next thing that should be done would be the beginning of the service, it's particular to Yom Kippur, but because now we have to install a new high priest, we're going to dress him in the 8 garments of the high priest that he wears every day. And he has to now do some kind of service that a Kohen can do. And so what he'll do, but the service until now has already been done. The next service can only be done by a Kohen Gadol wearing the 4 garments, not the 8 garments. So what does he do? So he says, this is what you do. You dress him up in the 8 garments, and you let him go up onto the altar, and he takes one of the forks, and he turns over one of the pieces of the morning sacrifice. He turns it over to make it burn a little faster. Because Rav Huna, this goes according to the opinion of Rav Huna. Rav Huna, Zar shehafach betzinora chayav mita. A person who is not a priest, who would go up onto the altar and then just take one of the forks and push around the limbs that are burning on the altar, he is liable to capital punishment, because just turning over the limbs on the altar that was a service that only a priest could do. So that's Abaye. This is what Abaye says. We first will show, we'll dress him in the garments that the high priest wears, and he'll do one service that could be done now, even though we really finished bringing the sacrifice. We'll let him do like one extra thing with the sacrifice, to go up onto the altar and take one of the forks and turn over one of the pieces of meat that's burning on the altar. Okay, so that's how Abaye answers this question. Rav Papa says, actually, you don't have to go so far. Avodato mechanchato. His service is enough to initiate him into being the high priest. What does that mean? We'll see in a second. Mi lo tanya. Didn't we learn in a Braita? Kol kelim shasa Moshe meshichatan mikadeshtan. Didn't we learn that all of the vessels that Moses made, his anointing them made them holy. In other words, made them dedicated for use in the temple. Mikan ve'elach avodotan mechanchatan. But from there and on, their service is what initiated them into service in the temple. What does all this mean? When Moses, the Torah tells us, Rashi quotes this. Here, I'll bring the verse from here. In Bamidbar, in Parshat Naso, there's a verse that says, on the day that Moses finished erecting the tabernacle, and he anointed it, and he sanctified it, and he sanctified all of its vessels, he sanctified the altar, and all of the vessels for the altar, and he anointed them and he sanctified them. So it means that in that generation, when Moses actually erected the tabernacle, so part of the initiation of the tabernacle itself was all of these things had to be anointed with oil, just like the priests were anointed with oil. All of these things that are laid out in that verse are anointed with oil. So there's a Braita that says all of the vessels that Moses made, in other words, that he made to use in the tabernacle, Mishichatan Mikadashtan, anointing them is what made them holy, in other words, and that's what initiated them into their service to be used for service in the tabernacle. So Hachanami Avodatam Mechanchata. So here all, but Mikan ve'elach Avodatam Mechanchatan. But from here on, in other words, in generations that came after Moses, whenever they brought in new vessels, and we already saw examples of this, right? Because we had new vessels that were brought in the Second Temple period that we described, in the Mishnah. So we know that they bring in new vessels. So how do those also need to be anointed? So no, Braita says that no, after Mikan ve'elach, from that time on, they did not need to be anointed. Merely using them in their designated service, that's what designated them. That's what initiated them to become holy vessels. So here also, Rav Papa makes the argument, when I need to initiate a new high priest, he's just like the vessels that are used in the Beit HaMikdash, and it's enough that he does service of the high priest. Once he does service, that's what makes him a high priest. And Rashi here says, Avodat Yom HaKippurim Atzma. In other words, how do we know he's the high priest? Because he will now do service of Yom Kippur itself, which we know is only kosher to be done by a high priest. Zeh ovda b'chanchato lekehuna gdola. And so this one, when he does its service, that's what initiates him into becoming a high priest. How do we know that after the time of Moses, they did not need to anoint more kelim, the future kelim? So Rashi points out, this is learned in the Gemara in Masechet Shavuot. He says, first of all, it says, "Kedichtiv b'midbar v'imshachem v'kadesh otam." We know from the Torah that Moses anointed and thereby sanctified the vessels, and that's the verse that I quoted you from Bamidbar, from Numbers. But from there on, new vessels were not anointed. That we learn in Gemara and Shavuot because there's a drasha that says Otam b'mishicha, and if you want, you can look. I brought the drasha. It's in footnote 3, that it says that Moses anointed them, he anointed the vessels and sanctified them. And the Gemara says he sanctified them. It's exclusionary. He sanctified them by anointment. But it means that in future generations, they don't need anointment. It excludes future generations. Okay. So where are we? So we're talking here about how do we know that the understudy Kohen Gadol, when he has to, in fact, step in and become the Kohen Gadol, become the high priest, how do we know, or how is it that he officially becomes, he formally becomes the high priest? We said, Ravada Barava says, we'll know because he's going to be wearing a distinctive garment. He'll be wearing the white belt. So then we said, that's fine, according to one opinion that said that that white belt was distinct from all the other belts that all the other Kohanim wore. But what about, according to the person who says that that belt was exactly the same, or it was essentially the same as the belt that a common Kohen wore? So here we gave two responses. We said, Abaye says, okay, so we won't be able to tell by his belt, but what we'll do is we'll dress him up, even though the morning service, that part of the morning, the daily morning service is now finished, we'll dress him up in the regular clothing of the high priest, and he'll do like a little bit of an additional service to the service. He'll turn over some limb that's on the altar. And how do I know that that's service? Because if any other person who's not a Kohen does that, they're liable to capital punishment. So I understand that means, and I know that anybody who's not a priest who does service is liable to capital punishment. So just turning over this piece of meat that's burning on the altar is considered to be sufficiently a service that only a Kohen can do. And as Michael pointed out, because it's Yom Kippur, only the Kohen Gadol can do it. Only the Kohen Gadol could do that service. And Rav Papa says, I don't need to do that because I could just continue to do the next part of the service now. That's special to Yom Kippur. He can wear the special clothing of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. And even though I can't distinguish him by his belt, because his belt is the same belt as the regular Kohanim all year, but once he starts doing the work, the service of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, that's specific to Yom Kippur, that is sufficient to initiate him to declare that now he is, in fact, the high priest. And how do I know? Because I see him as he's like the vessels of the Mishkan that They only needed to be anointed by Moses in his time, but in future generations, using them for service was enough to initiate them. And so it is with a new Kohen Gadol. If he does service that only a Kohen Gadol can do, that makes him a Kohen Gadol. Let's go on a little further. Kiata Rav Dimi Amar avneto shel Kohen Hedyot. So now, after we've had this discussion, now we get to this underlying controversy about the avnet. So when Rav Dimi came, in other words, when Rav Dimi came, I believe we discussed this before. What does it mean when it says that so and so came? Where did they come from and where did they go? Anybody?
I don't remember which direction, but the ones, either it's coming to Babel from Palestine or vice versa.
Okay, so this is the Babylonian Talmud. So where did they come from and where did they arrive?
It must have come from Palestine to go to Babel.
Exactly. And when we see that term in the Yerushalmi, in the Palestinian Talmud, then we know they came from Babylonia to Palestine, right? It's used in both places because there were these Amoraim who would go back and forth. And so Rav Dimi was one of these people. So when he came from visiting Palestine, he came from Israel and he goes to Babylonia. So he brings this piece of learning. He says, actually, avneto shel Kohen Hedyot, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, this question of what the belt of a regular common Kohen was, is a subject of controversy between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Adamar, one of them says, shel kilayim. It was kilayim. It was a mixture. It was the mixture of wool and linen, right? And we know, of course, we haven't talked about it, but we all know, no one is allowed to wear kilayim. You're not allowed to wear a garment that's mixed with wool and linen unless you're a Kohen and unless you're wearing very specific garments. It's virtually the only heter for wearing kilayim. So one of them says, the Kohen Hedyot, the common Kohen, he wore a belt of kilayim, meaning that he wore the same belt that the high priest wore on a regular day. There was no distinction. They both wore these multicolored belts that were made from wool and linen. The Chadamar Shabots. And one of them, either Rebbe or Rebbe Ozar or Rebbe Shimon, said, no, actually, the regular Kohen wore a linen belt. Now the Gemara wants to try to figure out which rabbi held which opinion. Right? So we said before, when it says Chadamar v'Chadamar, one says and one says, we don't know which one said which. So now the Gemara wants to try to figure out which one said which. It doesn't always do this, but when they can, they try to do it. So it says, Tistayim the Rebbe Huda Amar Shel Kilayim. So let's conclude that Rebbe, he was the one who said that the avnet of the regular Kohen was of Kilayim, and it was the same as the avnet of the high priest. Why would I say that? Because I have another Braita, the Tanya. I learn in a Braita, Ein bein Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Hedyot, Ela avnet. There's no difference between the high priest and a common priest, except for the avnet. Divrei Rebbe. That's what Rebbe says. Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon Omer, af lo avnet. Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon says, no, there's no difference between the high priest and the common priest, not even the avnet. There is no difference. So on the face of it, it sounds like this is exactly the same argument that I'm talking about. And Rebbe is saying that for all other purposes, for all other looks, at least, the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hadiot they look the same, except that the Kohen Hadiot Ein bein Kohen Gadol Kohen Hadiot ela avnet, meaning that what? Okay, so in order to understand this properly, and we're almost at the end here, so I think we may pick up from here next time. We have to bear in mind, once again, that there are three sets of clothing, right? We have the clothing of the Kohen Hadiot every day, the Kohen Gadol every day, and the Kohen Gadol only on Yom Kippur. So when it says there's no difference between the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Hadiot, except for the avnet, we need to ask a question. What exactly is Rebbe talking about? What does it mean there's no difference except for the avnet? Does it mean that there's no difference between the Kohen Gadol and what he wears every day and the Kohen Hadiot and what he wears every day, except for the avnet? Well, that on the face of it can't be true, because there are lots of differences. The Kohen Gadol on any given day is wearing 4 more garments than the Kohen Hadiot. So what's the alternative? That there's no difference between what the Kohen Gadol wears on Yom Kippur and what the Kohen Hadiot wears every day, except for the avnet. That seems to be what the Gemara, that's what the Gemara wants us to think when we're reading this now. And then that would be a proof that Rebbe holds that the avnet of the common Kohen was the avnet of Kilayim. It was the multicolored avnet, because then I would read this line in the Braita as follows. There's no difference between the clothing that the high priest wears on Yom Kippur and the clothing that the common priest wears every day, except for the belt, where the high priest has a white belt on Yom Kippur and the common priest has a multicolored belt on every day. That's how the Gemara wants us to read this at this point. And Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer, af lo avnet. No, even that is not a difference. And so here the Gemara wants us to understand that Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon says no, that because there is no difference between the belt that the high priest wears on Yom Kippur and the belt of the common priest every day, because both of them wear white belts. We'll stop here. This is where the Gemara wants us to. The Gemara is going to challenge this in different ways. And next time I would like to finish the sugya. And then, even though there's going to be more to say about this, I do want to go back then to the Mishnah, because now we're in Chodesh Elul. I agreed with Shira, who I think you wrote me in an email, and this is something I also want to do. I want to take at least 1 or 2 classes to focus on the confessional that the high priest said over the different things. That's going to be immediately relevant to all of us. I want to understand that in greater depth, how it was phrased, why it was phrased the way it was phrased. And so I hope to start that next week, but I do want to finish this part off first. And then after we finish this, or maybe even now in the next day or so, I'll send you, I want to send you Shira's notes so that you can see. I will just skip to one point, which is the Rambam and most poskim up and up to and at least including the Aruch HaShulchan in his Aruch HaShulchan Ha'atid, where he paskins all of these questions, they go with the Manda Amar. We hear it's Rebbe. They go with what will ultimately include is Rebbe's opinion that only the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur wore the white linen belt, and the regular Kohen on a daily basis did wear a multicolored belt, like the regular belt of the Kohen Gadol. And I wanted to point that out because if you read through Rav Hirsch's comments, you need to understand that he's going with that idea that that's the halacha. But I wanted to point out that before we get to that, it was not so obvious that that's the halacha. But if you read what Rav Hirsch has to say about this, you can start to think about the implications of what difference does it make which belt he has. And I think next time we will talk about that after we finish this. So any last questions or comments before we end?
Yes, the whole thing is very strange if you think about it. On one hand, the Kedusha is considered as something intrinsic. On the other hand, you have all these objects and these deeds which are facts in the material world, and somehow you have to have a match between them. And in some way, it wouldn't matter because only a Kohen is either a Kohen Ragil or a Kohen Gadol. It's obvious by the way he got his function. So why does he need another kind of material sign, a material object to do this deed, to give a sign of this difference?
Okay, so let me just ask you something about your question. So when you say that Kedusha, right, that holiness is something that, how did you put it, that it's intrinsic?
That's the way I understand that the Gemara or the Mishnah sees it. They see it as something intrinsic, not as something which people confer to the objects, to the people, or to the deeds, and so on. It seems to me.
Okay, so does anybody want to reply to this based on some stuff that we talked about? Everybody's really tired. I don't want to. Not just you. We're all tired.
No, it seems to be that that a lot of kind and matter of Kedusha are a result of differentiation, of discerning, of deed, of, so it's not so clear. So to say it's like quality of material, it's a little bit dangerous and ambiguous to see, because so many, okay, that's a huge discussion first. But okay, you say in the halacha you have so many tuma and kamitameh, so it's very often a result of doing, and not the quality per se in the things, or like to hypostasize, to say that the quality per se in things. It's not true. But okay, so what is about the altar? So things coming to the altar are holy per se. So, but again, that's a result of doing. Or I'm an opponent against this philosophy of inherent Kedusha in things, because I find that it's a very deep wisdom in Judaism to see that a result on depending on function and of doing and discerning, differentiation. So that's my.
So,
Answer very short.
no. So this is what I want to say. And this actually, again, it brings us back to the very beginning of the class. And I know, Paul, you came in a little bit late, but in the very beginning of the class, we quoted this verse from Shmot. Ze hadavar asher ta'aseh lahem likadesh otam l'chahen li. This is the thing that you shall do to them, to Aaron and his sons, to sanctify them so that they can serve me as priests. In other words, here the Torah is telling us that there is a specific procedure that makes Aaron and his sons Kohanim. They were not born Kohanim. They were not in particular born Kohanim. They had to do this procedure. We also saw along the way, there's a similar implication in this verse from Bamidbar, from Numbers, that when Moses built the tabernacle, that he had to anoint, before he could sanctify the vessels, he had to anoint them. There was a procedure that made them sanctified. And
if you don't do the procedure, then it's not Kadosh. It's the same question today, for instance, about the Shabbat. The Shabbat is Kadosh, the seventh day. You have to sanctify it, but even if you wouldn't do the Kiddush, it's still Shabbat. It's the Kedusha is still there.
Very good. Why is Shabbat different? No, you're saying it's a great example. Why is Shabbat different than all of these things? What is the Torah say?
Also, Am Yisrael is Kadosh. Now, because it's Kadosh, you have to do all this. You have to respect the halacha. But even if you don't respect the halacha, you still
have a
Jew, and you still have the kedusha. I think so. That's the way the things are.
Yeah, no, there's a Gemara that says
that's the conception. I think that's yes.
So what's special about Shabbat? What does the Torah say about the kedusha of Shabbat?
No, it's because the Kadosh Baruch Hu. No, this is an explanation why it's Kadosh, but it doesn't come from us. It comes from.
What's the idea? What's the explanation? What is the Torah
there
say?
Are two, there's Briat HaOlam and also Yetziat Mitzrayim, the fact that you...
okay, when it talks about the creation of the world, it says, Vayikadosh Oto. God made it. Okay, this is that's reinforced in Parshat Emor. In Parshat Emor, when it lists all of the Moadim, it's
But the Moadim, we do them, the Kedusha is understanding. Yes.
Right, Shabbat is something we don't get to sanctify. God sanctifies them. And in a way, it's the example that proves all the other ones. In other words, okay, when God sanctifies it, that's truly inherent sanctification. We can't touch that. That's always going to be sanctified. But there are other things that are in our power to either sanctify or not. So let's say the holidays, there is a certain Breirat Mechdal, right? There's a certain stopgap at some point. There's a certain default where the Kedusha will kick in. But we are the ones who in principle sanctify the holidays. And when we're talking about Kelim, we are the ones who make the Kelim Kadosh. And in fact, if you remember when we were talking about the Kiyor and the special the Mukhni that was in addition to the Kiyor, so we saw one of the way the Rambam understood that Mukhni was, he said it was another kli, it was another vessel that was like a tank that was on top of the original Kiyor that held water, but because it wasn't sanctified, the water that stayed in it overnight did not become invalid, right? And in other words, that was exactly the contribution, that we put a vessel that we use in the Beit HaMikdash that wasn't sanctified. So just by mere fact that it was connected to the Kiyor and actually brought water into the Kiyor did not make it sanctified, and that was its utility, that was its use. Because we wanted something, according to that opinion, that wasn't sanctified. But Paul, it's a great question, and I think what I'm telling you is how I see the basic answer. But this idea of kedusha, largely, for most of the things that we encounter as Jews, that we think of as being kadosh, are dependent on us. And I can tell you, as a sofer stam, if I don't say at the beginning of writing a Sefer Torah that I'm writing this for the Shem Kedushat Sefer Torah, I'm writing it for the sake of the holiness of the Torah, that Torah is pasul. It does not have any intrinsic holiness. You're not allowed to get rid of it because it's like a printed book and it has God's name in it, which you're not allowed to erase. But it's not a true Sefer Torah. So my declaration is what makes it kadosh. Shira brought up another example, which actually is, which seems to maybe, or at least gives a different perspective on this, which is we learn, and you can see this in the Mishnah in the beginning of Zvachim, anything that gets put up onto the Mizbeach that in principle could be a korban, in principle could be a sacrifice, it's kasher, meaning it does achieve a certain level of holiness. Right? It's the very first Mishnah in Zvachim. Kol hazvachim shenizbachu shelo lishman. All of the zvachim, all of the sacrifices that were slaughtered not for their sake. In other words, like you were bringing a korban, let's say korban olah, and it was supposed to be for, let's say, one of the holiday olot, and you didn't shecht it for it to be one of the holiday olot. Even so, it's still kosher. Actually, that's if you were bringing an olah that was in a dava, right? That was a volunteer sacrifice, and you didn't sacrifice it for the intended purpose. It's still kosher. It just doesn't count as fulfilling the obligation of the people who own it. Okay, that's getting a little technical here, but there is this idea also of psulei mukdashim, the things that are pasul, that are put up onto the altar. It depends on what they are, but in some cases you do have to take them off the altar, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes they acquire, as it were, a kind of kedusha simply because they were put on the altar. There are other conditions that are involved. So in short, it's a bit of a complicated question, but the short answer is that things that we understand require kedusha that are not, in fact, inherently kadosh, that were not sanctified by God. Those are things we have to sanctify, and so we do have to do something to sanctify. Daniel, you want to ask a question?
Yes, well, I have a comment about Kedusha of Shabbat. I think it's a very good example because Hashem make a procedure to arrive to the Shabbat, right? He make a work, 6 days of work, and then the product of this work comes to the Shabbat. So the Shabbat gets sanctified because of the work that was before. So maybe that's the example here, applied to the kedusha of the Kohen. He had to make something. He had to make a work in order to obtain the kedusha. So that's my idea. And something about the Gemara that is curious for me is that it puts all the time. It puts examples that we were there observing the Kohen or the Kohen working, like we were in a movie, no? It's like we are there and we imagine that they are doing this or that, and then because of the acts of them, we realize or we can or how what they are wearing. In this example, the belt, we can realize that one of them is a Kohen Gadol because he is doing things to to get this kedusha. I know I can express the idea well.
No, but okay, so let me just summarize a little bit what you said. I think you're making a really interesting point, that you're saying that even for God, when God sanctified the Sabbath, he did it not just by, as it were, declaring it, but it came on the heels of a series of acts. So as it were, the investiture of the seventh day to be the Sabbath was the result of everything that came before that led up to the Sabbath. And what you want to say is that that's the parallel, that here, where the Torah says, let's say, when we invest the priests to become priests, that we also need to do an act to bring up to that point. And that's certainly at least one of the opinions, or you could argue that's something that's agreed upon in the Gemara, because even according to the person who says we can tell who the Kohen Gadol is by the belt, you might argue that wearing the clothing of the Kohen Gadol itself is a kind of service, even before he does any act. That's actually a bit of a separate question, but I think what you're bringing is a very interesting point, and it's worth pondering to go back next time we learn Breshit, to think about that, to think, could Hashem have sanctified the Sabbath had it not been for the 6 days of Melacha? Right? Very good point. Okay, I think let's leave it there for now. Next time we'll pick up where we were in the sugya. We'll finish the sugya. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the avnet, and then I would like to go on to talk about the vidui, about the confession. So thank you, everybody, and Chodesh Tov. Have a good
Thank you.
night.
Good night. Chodesh Tov.
For the stove.
Thank you.
Bye.